Hi, I'm Leah.
And I'm Phelan. You know us as the hosts of the podcast, The Secret Life of Canada.
And we've got an exciting bit of news for you.
We do. We want to go to school with you.
That's right. We are now part of the curriculum in a way. We've teamed up with educators from across the country to create teaching guides that go along with some of our best episodes.
We've got teaching guides for Indigenous history.
Caribbean Canadian migration, Black history. Just head to cbc.ca/teaching guides for more info. And it's free.
It's free.
This is a CBC podcast.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. It seems like every time I open my podcast app, there's a new Indigenous-focused podcast to listen to. As more and more Indigenous creatives turn to podcasting as a way to share stories, how they want to tell them.
Just to bring the voice of someone in your community to the air is very empowering.
Why Indigenous literatures matter is exactly the reason why we started this podcast.
For a long time, there just wasn't an understanding that these were valuable stories.
That's today on Unreserved. A few months ago, I was scrolling through Twitter and I came across a tweet by writer and former CBC host Wabgijik Rice. It read, "So, who'd be interested in a podcast about Indigenous literature?" I thought to myself, I would. And apparently so would a lot of other people. The tweet got over 8,000 likes. Storykeepers podcast launched in March and it's already getting a lot of attention. The pod is all about Indigenous literature, and it's hosted by Wabgijik Rice and writer Jennifer David. Jennifer is Cree and Anishinaabe from the Chapleau Cree First Nation, and Wab is Anishinaabe from the Wasauksing First Nation. They join me now to talk all about Storykeepers. Welcome to the show, you two.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, Phelan. Thank you.
So, Jennifer, while Wab's tweet got a lot of attention, this isn't where the idea started. Storykeepers is something that you've been thinking about for years now. How did the idea come to you?
Well, like all good things, it's a whole bunch of things that sort of coalesced and came together. Wasn't just one light bulb moment. And I go back, maybe 20 years to my own sort of idea of a book club, a physical book club in person with my girlfriends. And that idea of sitting around with friends, talking about books, I just liked that idea. And so I've been doing that just on my own. Other pieces kind of came in. One of them is, the government announced, a few years ago that June was Indigenous Book Club Month, whatever that means. And so I thought, that's a great idea. But I didn't really see, anybody picking it up or what that would mean. And then I thought, what about a podcast? And then I said, okay, a podcast is a great idea, but I would never do that on my own. And I thought, I'd love to do this podcast with another Indigenous writer. And Wab was the only person that ever came to mind. We met on a panel years ago, and I thought he would be a fabulous host because he's got a background in journalism. I've got a background in journalism. We'd have no problem talking. He's an author, no problem talking about writing and about books. And we both obviously love Indigenous literature. So that's where the idea came from. A whole bunch of different ideas came together.
And Jennifer, for listeners who haven't tuned in yet, what can they expect to hear? What's the format of Storykeepers?
You can go online and you can find all kinds of interviews with Indigenous writers. So if you want to know what the author thinks about their book or find out about the authors, there's lots of places to get that. But where can you go to hear what other Indigenous writers feel and think about Indigenous books themselves? And there wasn't really much that I saw out there. And so I thought that would be a good idea. And there's going to be Wab and I as co-hosts, but we're going to invite every month a different Indigenous writer as another co-host. So there'll be three of us having a conversation about one book by an Indigenous author.
So you both are published writers and book lovers. Wab, can you tell me where your love of literature began?
I would say it has its roots in my upbringing, in my community, and having that strong connection to storytelling, because that's how I learned about being an Anishinaabe person as a kid in the 80s in Wasauksing. So sharing stories was always a big part of my upbringing. By the time I got to high school, I became a lot more interested in books and in literature through English class. And I really liked creative writing assignments as well. But back then, I obviously didn't see myself reflected at all in the books that we discussed in the sort of provincial curriculum in Ontario, right? Because there was pretty much no representation of BIPOC authors at all back then, back in the 1990s. And I had an aunt, my Auntie Elaine Kelly. She was one of my first teachers on the Reserve when I was a kid. And she always was interested in my educational journey. And when I was in about grade 10 or 11, I think, she asked me what my favorite class was in high school. And I said it was English because, I enjoyed reading books and I like creative writing. And she asked me, what the books we were reading were. And I said, like Shakespeare and, Who Has Seen the Wind by W.O. Mitchell and like Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger and all that. And she just kind of like took note of that. And then afterwards, she started giving me books for my birthday and for Christmas by Indigenous authors like Lee Miracle and Thomas King and Richard Wagamese, Richard Van Camp, Louise Erdrich, all these groundbreaking, trailblazing authors at the time who I wasn't exposed to through the education system. But I had, fortunately, a family member who got me onto that path and opened my eyes to that world and essentially changed my life.
And what about for you, Jennifer? Where did you develop your love of Indigenous books?
Well, I was born and raised in Chapleau in Northern Ontario. It's just a small town. And really, we had a small public library and a small library at our school. That's the only place I ever saw books. So where the love came from, it wasn't from anyone in my family. My mom and dad didn't have post-secondary education. But the idea of reading to transport you to other places and other worlds, especially perhaps when you come from a small place or an isolated place, reading really allowed me to travel and see different perspectives, go to different places. And so I ate up everything that I could. I cringe a little bit now because the kind of books available on the bookshelves were like Stephen King and, V.C. Andrews, like in the 80s, right? But I didn't know any better. That's what was there. So that's what I read. When I got to university, it was when I was like, wow, Indigenous literature, like that's amazing, right? The people are writing stories that I can actually relate to. And I talk about in the first episode a particular poem by Armand Garnet Rufo, and he's an Anishinaabe poet, and he had a book of poems, and one of those poems just happened to be on our curriculum for this Indigenous literature course, and it was called Kebshkawashishing, and that is the name of the river where I lived in Chapleau, like right where my house was, a few houses down was this river, and I was just blown away. I thought, somebody has written about my river, somebody has done it in a poetic way, and somebody from Chapleau actually became a published writer. Like all these things, right? Maybe for kids now in 2021, I think are obvious, but was not obvious to me when I was growing up.
Yeah, there was some V.C. Andrews in my life as a youth as well. So, nothing wrong with a little V.C. Andrews. So, Wob, I kind of want to say to you that famous line from The Godfather, just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. You left CBC to work on your writing. And I know many people missed hearing your voice and miss hearing your voice. But now they can listen to you again, in podcast form. How is podcasting different for you from being on the CBC airwaves?
Oh, it's a lot different. And I find myself trying to adjust to that, right? Because I was so conditioned by CBC to stick to certain formats and to follow the clock. And even like we talk about code switching and changing your voice for certain audiences. I engage some of that too, using my town voice compared to my res voice, right? So when I listen back to our first episode, I was like, oh man, I'm still sounding like the city guy. I think with our natural conversation we're trying to have, I can, go back to my roots, I guess you could say. I look back very fondly on my CBC career. And of course, I miss all the people I worked with, and I miss all the people I got to connect with, through the radio, through TV, through online. And I always sort of knew that getting into podcasting was, a foregone conclusion because, I had the technical skills and just I know how to string a few coherent sentences together on the air. So I knew I was going to get into it eventually, but I didn't want it just to be like, Wob rants about X, Y, and Z, right? And when Jennifer, she first, mentioned this idea to me years ago, but she came back last spring once I was done with CBC, and it was perfect timing. And it was like a very specific idea that I could totally latch onto because I'm devoting my professional world to literature now, right? Like that's my main focus. So to be able to talk every month about a book that we love with somebody else who loves that book was just a really cool idea. And I was totally on board.
And Jennifer, the first episode of Story Keepers focuses on the book Why Indigenous Literature Matters by Cherokee writer and scholar Daniel Heath Justice. Why was that book the one that you decided to start with?
Well, why Indigenous literatures matter is exactly the reason why we started this podcast, right? Because Indigenous literatures matter, we want to have a podcast and talk about it. So it seemed like the perfect book to lay the foundation for what we're trying to say throughout the rest of our seasons, which I hope will be for many seasons to come.
And Wob, the podcast will look at literature across genres, from poetry to plays, fiction, nonfiction. Why did you want to span across these diverse genres?
The main focus is still going to be fiction. Most of the books we discuss will be by fiction writers. But, of course, we do want to represent as many different genres as possible. So that's why we want to include poetry. We want to include plays, nonfiction as well. Because, as Indigenous people, speaking more broadly, we're obviously not limited to one genre or one way of telling stories. I think the way that Indigenous cultures have adapted their spoken stories to the written word, we've been able, more broadly to embrace these different methods of telling our stories, whether it's through poetry, whether it's through plays, whether it's through filmmaking, documentaries, visual arts, whatever else, right? So there's a beautiful diversity within Indigenous storytelling as a whole, and we want to be able to reflect that as best as we can.
I have to just add that we set up a little email address, started reading through the emails that were coming to Story Keepers podcast, and I laughed with Wob. I said most of them were from publishers saying, hey, we've got authors with Indigenous books, don't forget about them. And then one of them was from somebody saying, I saw your list and I was so disappointed you only had one book of poetry, right? So we're never going to please everyone. And I think that's why we very clearly say, listen, this is our opinions, we're just readers, and we're just picking books that interest us. We're not paid by publishers to, promote certain books. We're just talking about books that interest us, and then we want to talk about it. We have the whole list on our website for the whole season.
Jennifer, what can listeners expect from the upcoming episodes?
So we're doing Richard Wagamese' Medicine Walk. And, later on in the year, it looks like we're going to get Senator Murray Sinclair to talk to us and talk with us about Tanya Talaiga's book, Seven Fallen Feathers, which is our one of our two nonfiction books. Again, it's a very difficult sort of story, but we thought that was an important one to talk about in this first season. And then we'll have, of course, Return of the Trickster, because that was, we wanted to be able to have some brand new books as well. So we'll have a discussion about that. So really, it was just Wob and I going through lists of books that we've read or we want to read, and we said, hey, let's talk about this one and let's talk about this one. And so that's how we came up with a big long list.
I'm getting really excited over here already, just hearing some of the things that you want to cover. Thank you both for taking the time to chat with me today.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Story Keepers is out now, and a new episode drops on the 4th of every month. You can find Story Keepers wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Leah.
And I'm Phelan. You know us as the hosts of the podcast The Secret Life of Canada.
And we've got an exciting bit of news for you.
We do. We want to go to school with you.
That's right. We are now part of the curriculum in a way. We've teamed up with educators from across the country to create teaching guides that go along with some of our best episodes.
We've got teaching guides for Indigenous history,
Caribbean Canadian migration, Black history. Just head to cbc.ca/teaching guides for more info, and it's free.
It's free.
I'm Jeremy Ratt. I'm half Indigenous and half white. Pieces is an all-new CBC British Columbia original podcast. This is a story of being stuck between two worlds, not really fitting in with either of them.
So because I don't have darker skin or long brown hair, that therefore I was not Indigenous.
You don't have to be a residential school survivor yourself to be traumatized by residential school.
Pieces. Listen to it now, wherever you get your podcasts.
so much of my work, and really my life, is spent immersed in the lives of women that I can never meet. Women who have been stolen from their families and communities. Women whose lives have been cut short, but who I imagine still need justice.
That familiar voice is Connie Walker. She was on the CBC airwaves for more than 20 years. Connie is not new to podcasting. Her work in this space is focused on telling the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women. You might be familiar with her critically acclaimed series Finding Cleo and Missing and Murdered, Who Killed Alberta Williams. Both were produced at CBC. And now her latest podcast, Stolen, The Search for Germaine, is out now through Gimlet Media. Connie is Cree from Okanese First Nation, and she joins me now. Welcome to the show, Connie.
Thanks for having me.
So who is Germaine Charlo, and what drew you to her story?
Sure. So Germaine Charlo is a 23-year-old woman who's a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana. She's a mother of 2 young boys. She's a granddaughter, a daughter, a sister, a cousin, and she's someone who's so loved and missed by her family. You know, Germaine, it's a kind of a weird job, I think, that I have in that I so often I'm getting to learn about people after they're gone through their families, who are the ones who are left, really trying to find the answers for them. And that's really how I felt like I've gotten to know Germaine a little bit. Her family talks about how funny she was and artistic, and if she comes from a really close-knit family with a lot of strong women, and everything I've learned about her is that she's also, an incredibly strong young woman who's been through a lot in her 23 years, and she's been missing for the last 2.5 years, and her family has been searching for answers and fighting for justice, and trying to find Germaine and bring her home.
And this story takes place in the U.S., and, you had done some reporting in the U.S., but you hadn't spent much time there. I'm wondering about what the difference is in reporting on the other side of the medicine line.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of differences. I think that, Indigenous people, we probably recognize that we share a lot of similarities in that, we've all experienced colonization and been impacted by colonization. And so, unfortunately, I feel like there are a lot of things around surviving genocide and being affected by, institutional racism and being dispossessed from our lands. Or those are things that we have in common. But there are also, a lot of differences in terms of the way our two countries, the history of these two countries, and the relationship that Indigenous people have had with settlers is very different. And so, for me, it was a really steep learning curve, and just I wanted to make sure that even though I'm Indigenous, that I wasn't taking anything for granted, and that I was doing the work and trying to understand, just what it means to be that in the United States. And there I think the conversations are also quite different in the U.S. Like in Canada, I feel like, we've been talking about violence against Indigenous women and girls for quite a few years now. Like for a long time, it was ignored, but those conversations have been happening. I feel like we've really, there's been a huge shift in terms of not just the number of stories that we're doing in Canada, but the kinds of stories that we're doing. And it feels like that's just starting to happen in the U.S. in some ways. And so, I think there are a number of differences. It's been a real learning curve.
And the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, they've become really central to your work as a storyteller. You are now working with Gimlet Media, a podcast company based in the U.S. Why did Gimlet become the home for the stories that you wanted to tell?
For me, it really was after, almost 20 years at CBC, doing all kinds of different jobs and working in all kinds of different departments at CBC. I worked in news and current affairs and radio and podcasting. And at one point, I even did a lifestyle show at CBC. And I worked in children's and youth. That was kind of, my big start. But I think that I've always had this interest in reporting in our communities and reporting stories about Indigenous people. And I've always seen that we weren't doing enough of that. And for a long time, there just wasn't an understanding that these were valuable stories and that these were perspectives that needed to be shared and told. And once that shift happened, once those conversations started changing, once the shift in newsrooms happened, and there was more of that recognition, I wanted to continue. And I really found that podcasting was and is one of the best platforms to tell stories from our communities, because the context is so important. We can't separate this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls from all of the other issues that Indigenous people live and experience. And sometimes when you have 2 minutes for a news story or 500 words for an article, it's really hard to connect those dots in a meaningful way. And it's really hard to provide that really important context. And, I learned through making Missing and Murdered just what a gift podcasting can be, and serialized storytelling in particular, that you get to spend, 8 episodes on a single story, on a single family. You can dive in so deeply and really show, in Cleo's case, obviously it was about the child welfare system, and show that how that, being part of the 60s Scoop impacted not just her, but her siblings and their entire lives, and how that was tied back to the legacy of residential schools and the trauma that her own mother experienced as a child. And having the space to really, I think, investigate all of that and tie those together. I think what we found is that it has so much impact, not just, for the listener, so that people can come away with a different understanding. They can come away feeling, I think that what you get to do in podcasting is you get to kind of create space for people to have empathy for people that they don't recognize themselves in, or people who have such a different lived experience. And for me, I wanted to be able to continue that. I wanted to be able to do podcasting full time. And so I actually reached out to Gimlet. I was like, are you interested in me coming over? And that was the beginning of that conversation. But, I'm grateful to be in a place that prioritizes, this kind of storytelling and creates space for these kinds of conversations.
And true crime podcasts, they are often criticized because they can sensationalize or romanticize the deaths of real people. How do you toe the line with a podcast like this, to make it interesting for an audience, but to not sensationalize it?
Yeah, I think it's a very fine line that we're walking in terms of trying to do that. It's something I struggle with a lot. I think the thing that I struggle with is that it becomes a story, like some kind of entertainment, that their deepest pain and trauma is then consumed by people, for as something they're doing, for fun, for entertainment. And that's something I struggle with a lot, especially because I think I don't do that. I find it very difficult to consume violence for entertainment. I don't listen to true crime podcasts, and I don't listen to the true crime documentaries on Netflix or whatever. And so I try to be very sensitive to that these are real people. This is not a story. This is Germaine's life, and this is her family's life and experience, and this is the real pain that they've been through since she went missing. And this is the real grief. And obviously I think that it's important that they have their voices be amplified to share those experiences. And I think that what Germaine represents and what Cleo represents and what Alberta represents about the bigger issue of violence that Indigenous women and girls face is really important. And it's been ignored for so long in media, and that we really need to create space for these stories so that people can start to understand the truth about the experiences that we live and the realities that we face as Indigenous women and girls in Canada and in the United States.
On a personal level, what was it about Germaine's story and Cleo's story and Alberta's story and all these women's stories that, that makes you want to do this work?
It's about telling the truth about our lives as Indigenous women and girls. And it's about, I think about growing up in my community and my family on my reserve, and obviously consuming all of the media, and whether it's, even if it's not news, if it's everything else, like TVs and books and movies, and being a part of it, and on one hand, because you're growing up and this is part of you're part of society, you're part of this world, but also feeling so separate from it for a lot, like not seeing yourself reflected, not like, I remember like at one point when I was in elementary school, like one of my aunts had passed away, another one of my aunts had passed away, and we were going to the wake and the funeral, and having white friends who grew up half an hour away from us, who I was my best friends and really close with, who had never been to a funeral, who didn't, and just like having like that one example of like, there's a difference, and we're so similar. We're growing up half an hour away from each other, but we're living different lives in so many ways, and that was never reflected in the news, in the media, and I think that in order to really try to even address some of these issues that we face, we really need to understand them. And the first part of that is exposing them and talking about them and having people become aware. Like the fact that 84% of Indigenous women in the United States are going to experience some kind of physical, sexual, or emotional violence. The fact that, 1 in 2 experience some kind of sexual violence, like 1 in 2. And that those statistics, are probably higher, that not every case is reported. And those are, again, statistics, but the impact that they have on individual women and families and whole communities is devastating, and we need to know about it, and we need to talk about it. We need to understand it in order to even think about addressing it and making a difference for girls like Cleo and Jermaine and Alberta and you and me and everybody in our families. That's why I want to do this.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, Connie. I'm so excited to listen to the rest of the podcast series. It's great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's so nice to talk to you and providing these really important perspectives. And yeah, I'm happy to join you.
That was Connie Walker, host of Stolen, The Search for Jermaine. You can listen to the series on Spotify. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. Checking out some Indigenous podcasts on the show this week.
Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about Mi'kmaq people, politics, land, and water. I'm Glenn Wheeler.
That's a clip from a podcast called Mi'kmaq Matters. It's hosted by Glenn Wheeler. He's a member of the Hullabu Mi'kmaq First Nation. Glenn is also a journalist and a lawyer, and he makes his podcast in his spare time. He records the show from his home in Toronto, which is where I've reached him today. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phelan. Nice to be here.
So why did you want to start this podcast?
In some ways, I do it as much for myself as I do it for the community. It's a way for me to connect. As you mentioned, I live in Toronto, so I'm geographically far away. So it's a way for me to be on the ground virtually, talking to people, knowing what's going on. It helps me be there even when I'm physically not there. So it's therapeutic as well as other things.
So there was this personal dimension for you to start this podcast, to stay connected to your community. And was it also a way to fill a gap you saw for independent Indigenous media?
For sure. For us, for the Hullabu Band, which, as you may know, we're just celebrating the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the band. So we're a relatively young First Nation. So it's a way to locate our band in the entire Mi'kmaq community. We're in Newfoundland, but we have Mi'kmaq people in the state of Maine, in Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, of course. So the information sharing is community building. and also leads to a sense of solidarity with being Mi'kmaq people.
For listeners who aren't familiar with your podcast, how would you describe Mi'kmaq Matters?
It's a podcast that covers all dimensions of the Mi'kmaq experience: political, spiritual, environmental. One day we might be doing a podcast on concerns about a gold mine. And the next episode might be about someone's efforts to try and provide the option of Mi'kmaq burials. Or it could be a story about the upcoming full moon and what that full moon is for Mi'kmaq people. Traditionally, what it told our ancestors about the life cycle. So we try to touch all the bases of what it is to be Mi'kmaq in 2021.
And the format of the podcast is interview-based. Why did you feel it was important to go that route?
We hear so few of those voices in our media, so just to bring the voice of someone in your community to the air is very empowering. I think it makes people understand that those stories are just as important as any other story.
There's an episode of your podcast that stood out for me. The episode was titled Nalcor Energy's Blueberry Blunder. Can you explain what that episode is about and why it was important for you to cover that story?
There's an area in southern Newfoundland where is the right-of-way for these power lines. And because they cut the underbrush under these power lines in the right-of-way, it's perfect blueberry grounds. It's also perfect because people, particularly older people with mobility issues, can get to this area. So this past summer and the summer before, 2 summers in a row now, Nalcor, which is a utility company in Newfoundland and Labrador, sprayed this right-of-way to keep this undergrowth from growing. Doing that, of course, they sprayed the blueberries. So people who were coming to this area for years and years and years showed up and found these warning signs that these blueberries had been sprayed.
Let's hear a clip from that episode.
We're used to knowing where the berries grows, and it's easy access to it. So we like to go there. We've been picking them there for years and years, and we're upset. We're upset that it's destroyed this year. It's poisoning our area. And not only that, not only the berries, but you look at our wildlife. And that pole line is listed probably half a kilometer from Lloyd's River. Well, pole lines is an excellent spot for moose. There's new growth coming up, and along the side of the road, you always see moose there. Because the point is they like the young growth and stuff like that. And no, moose don't know if they're eating something that's been sprayed. No, I got to look for somewhere different. I'm going to keep it clear from the power lines where that's sprayed. I can guarantee you that.
That was Norm Strickland Sr. being interviewed by Glenn Wheeler on his podcast, Mi'kmaq Matters. So, Glenn, are there any challenges for you in reporting on the community that you're from?
Sometimes there are. I mean, if you're interviewing someone who is a community member who's doing some interesting project, of course, you're talking community member to community member, and it's a conversation. But sometimes you're in a more of a standard journalistic mode where, for example, there's some issue with what the band chief and council are doing. Maybe some people don't like what they're doing. You're always trying to do things in a way that's appropriate for the community. We are all part of the community, so you want to be respectful but challenging. And then, of course, not everyone appreciates criticism, so sometimes their feelings get a little ruffled.
Does it ever feel like you're navigating two worlds, or you're wearing two hats?
Totally, because I think what we all want is to be part of our community. We are all Mi'kmaq people. When you're the journalist, you're always the outsider. You always have this journalist cap. You're always at a distance, observing and are away from the participants. So it's kind of like a bit of a disembodied experience. It's we're doing a Mi'kmaq podcast, but sometimes the journalistic format causes some division, and that takes some emotional and journalistic navigation.
For myself, as someone who's working in an audio field more and more in my life, and I've done stories about my community, I know that I relate to that pressure you feel, and that feeling of living in two worlds. Does working on a show like this cost you emotionally?
It does. I mean, there's there are the people who, if they don't like an episode, they freeze you out after that. They don't respond to your emails. They don't respond to your texts. If you see them at the powwow, they might nod or they might head in another direction. So, and that hurts. You think that, okay, well, I'm just trying to do my best. It's accountability. People have a right to know. But that's a very, we're all human and trying to belong. And that, that has a sting to it, I must say.
So how do you take care of yourself in those moments when you do feel that sting?
I think all you can do is reflect and ask yourself if it was worth it. Ask yourself if there's something to learn from that. Could it have been done a different way? But I think we have to be mindful of it and mindful of what you're feeling, and not just ignore it and pretend it didn't happen. It did happen, and these are the consequences. So be mindful. Ask yourself if you're doing things in a good way, and deal with the next thing.
Glenn, I want to thank you for taking the time speaking with us about the podcast. It is really great.
Thanks so much.
Glenn Wheeler is the host of Mi'kmaq Matters. He's a member of the Hullabu Mi'kmaq First Nation. To find out more about his podcast, you can head to our websites, cbc.ca/unreserved. Denny Talk is a brand new podcast from Cassidy Vilbroon Baracus. The podcast features conversations between Cassidy and guests, and while that might sound pretty straightforward, the podcast is anything but. The show is ambitious and takes on a range of topics and never shies away from the difficult. From burlesque dancers to land defenders, Denny Talk is equal parts story sharing, education, and offers its listeners context that isn't overwhelming. Cassidy is a Decho Denny member of Katladeche First Nation with Métis heritage and Baltic European ancestry. He joins me now from Victoria. Welcome to the show, Cassidy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Cassidy, how would you describe Denny Talk?
Denny Talk is a podcast that kind of talks about Indigenous stories and explores indigeneity, but in a way that centers Indigenous voices first. And so the one thing that I really wanted to do with Denny Talk was really focus on Indigenous thought, Indigenous art, Indigenous joy, and Indigenous brilliance, while exploring kind of the history that has kind of led us to the place we're in at the same time. And so the inspiration for Denny Talk really comes from the Shut Down Canada movement over last year, and kind of the conflict in Wet'suwet'en, which builds on a lot of other movements as well. But just seeing that energy and seeing the stories and the connections and the relationships during that time that happened really inspired me. And in a lot of ways, Denny Talk builds upon the intellectual work that a lot of frontline land defenders bring to the table. A lot of Indigenous scholars and artists and poets and writers bring, and kind of showcasing that brilliance. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with Denny Talk.
And this is your first time working in audio. You got trained with your local campus radio station. What drew you to audio storytelling?
Since I was a very young child, I've always been interested in the radio, whether it was listening to the CBC with my mom or my dad, or listening to audiobooks. I was really into Star Wars audiobooks on long car rides. I've always really been connected to audio as a means of communication, because I think sometimes when I read, I can't really get into stuff as well. But when I listen to something, I really connects with me on a deeper level of understanding. And so I really am interested in audio as a form of storytelling or communication or sharing ideas.
So the titles of your first 3 episodes are Resilience, Resistance, and Resurgence. Why were those themes important for you to explore?
I think they're like the big 3 R's of indigeneity in Canada. I really wanted to showcase the ideas and the different forms. I thought it was a good way to kind of separate the stories.
And so let's take a listen to a clip from the podcast.
For Indigenous peoples, hospitals are inhospitable places, but birth workers like Pisu are helping to indigenize those spaces.
It's traumatizing being in those spaces. You kind of just like shut down. You go into survival mode. You kind of just surrender, because it is scary, and having someone there who is also an Indigenous person to advocate for you and to make space and to speak for you when you can't is so important.
That's a clip from Dene Talk, a new podcast hosted and produced by my guest, Cassidy Vilbruin-Baracus. So in that clip, you're interviewing Pisu Crane. And who is Pisu and what drew you to their story?
So Pisu is a sex educator, an Indigenous doula. They are queer. They are disabled. They live in Edmonton. What drew me to them is that they have a very big social media impact, essentially. And so I was kind of drawn to their Instagram page. They do a lot of learning. They're very sex positive. They're very open about living with disabilities and what that looks like as a reality for them. And so I really want to showcase their thoughts and ideas on Dene Talk because I think their story is very important, and I just really wanted to elevate their story as much as possible. I think that oftentimes stories of Indigenous people, especially Indigenous people with disabilities, aren't often highlighted. And so I just really want to highlight those voices. I think that was really important with.
Cassidy, you are really just getting started in many ways. Do you have any advice for people out there who want to create a podcast?
Yes. Just do it. Just do it. Just get started. And I think, like always, a good place to start is going to your community or campus radio station. They have the equipment, the know-how, and the wherewithal to help train you in audio production and give you advice. I think that there's a bunch of great resources online, from Transom to NPR to This American Life, Third Coast Festival. There's a lot of great online resources. And yeah, just do it, because I think that podcasting is such a beautiful field. It's unconstrained by what you can talk about. You can talk about anything that interests you or that you want to share. So I think that just get out there and start the journey. Yeah.
And so you have 3 episodes of the podcast out now. What can we expect from future episodes?
Yeah, so some of the issues that I'd love to talk about, I'd really love to do an episode about colorism, blood quantum, and pretendians, and talk about Indigenous identity and how it's changing and how it can be construed in harmful ways, which is a little bit of a meatier subject. I'd love to chat with some memers, because I think Indigenous meme culture is really fascinating, really interesting, and speaks a lot of truth to power. And another one is also Res Dogs, the organization, Save Res Dogs, because I think it's one of the greatest organizations out there. And yeah, so there's so many different concepts, but I am just really interested in those kinds of things. And also futurisms. Indigenous futurisms is one of my biggest passions. And yeah, just envisioning ourselves beyond a colonial lens to to speak to identity that is comes from us. Yeah. So lots of different stuff.
Yeah. No shortage of ideas.
Yeah.
Well, I have hit subscribe on my podcast app. And I hope everybody else does too, because it is a great show. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a dream to be able to chat with you.
That was Cassidy Vilbruin-Baracus speaking about his new podcast, Dene Talk. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. If you want to get in touch with us, email unreserved@cbc.ca or find us on Facebook or Twitter. If you haven't subscribed to our podcast yet, you can find us on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Sean Vanderklis, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. I'm Phelan Johnson. Now a go for listening.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.